The summer of 1842 came to Georgia like a fever that wouldn't break. Heat rose from the red clay in waves thick enough to taste, and the cotton fields of Fairmont Plantation stretched toward a horizon that shimmered and lied about mercy. 300 acres of white bowls, waiting to be picked by hands that would never own the fruit of their labor. 200 souls bound to those acres by chains made of law, violence, and a cruelty so casual it had become the rhythm of daily life. Sarah remembered the first time she saw the oak. She had been 6 years old, clinging to her mother's skirt as they walked past the edge of the cotton fields toward the quarters. The tree stood alone on a small rise, its branches spreading like the arms of something ancient and patient. Even then, before she understood what happened there, she had felt something wrong in its shade. Her mother's grip had tightened on her hand. "Don't look at it too long, child," Mama had whispered. "That tree drinks tears." Sarah hadn't understood, not then. The Fairmont estate rose from the Georgia countryside like a monument to everything that money built on suffering could buy. White columns, wide verandas, windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back like diamonds. Inside, crystal chandeliers from France, furniture from England, silver that had to be polished until you could see your face in it, which Sarah did every Tuesday and Friday, kneeling on the dining room floor while her reflection stared back at her from a serving tray worth more than her life. Margaret Fairmont had been born into wealth and married into more of it. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you. At 32, she was still beautiful in the way that certain white women of the South were beautiful. Pale skin protected from the sun, dark hair arranged in elaborate curls that took Sarah an hour to pin each morning, hands soft because they had never worked a day that mattered. But it was her eyes that told the truth about her. Blue and cold as a January sky, they looked at the enslaved people of Fairmont the way someone might look at livestock, appraising, calculating. Utterly devoid of recognition that what they were seeing was human. Sarah had lived in the main house since she was 8 years old, taken from the quarters to serve as Margaret's personal maid. She learned to move like a shadow, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make herself so small and so useful that she became invisible. It was a survival skill all house slaves learned or died trying to master. She learned other things too. She learned that Margaret Fairmont liked her tea at precisely 4 o'clock, that she flew into rages over the smallest imperfections, that she saved her worst cruelty for the hottest days when the heat made everyone's temper short. She learned that Master Edmund Fairmont, Margaret's husband, spent most of his time in Savannah tending to business interests and mistresses, leaving his wife to run the plantation with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. And she learned that Margaret took pleasure in punishment, not the administrative necessity of maintaining discipline that other plantation mistresses delegated to overseers. No, Margaret enjoyed it. She would walk the fields on inspection days, her parasol twirling, looking for any excuse to find fault. A slave who straightened up too soon, stretching an aching back. A child who sang too loudly. Someone whose eyes lingered a moment too long. The punishments were always carried out at the oak. By the time Sarah turned 15, she had witnessed more than 30 lashings beneath those branches. She had learned to keep her face blank, to swallow her tears, to hold her mother's hand when they made them all watch. Because they were always made to watch. That was part of it. The lesson wasn't just for the person being punished. Sarah's mother, Ruth, worked in the fields. Her hands were rough as tree bark, her back permanently bent from years of stooping over cotton plants. But her spirit had remained unbroken in ways that amazed Sarah. Even after the worst days, even after seeing friends sold away or children torn from their mother's arms, Ruth would sit in their small cabin at night and hum the old songs. Songs that had come across the ocean in the bellies of slave ships, songs that carried memories of a home no one living had ever seen. "Why do you sing, Mama?" Sarah had asked once, after a particularly brutal day when a field hand named James had been whipped for breaking his picking basket. Ruth had looked at her daughter with eyes that held both sorrow and something fiercer. "Because they can take everything else, baby girl, but they can't take what's inside us, not unless we let them." Sarah tried to believe that. She tried to carry that strength with her as she moved through the Fairmont house, laying out Margaret's dresses, arranging her hair, serving her meals, listening to her gossip with other plantation wives about balls and fashions and the rumors of trouble brewing in the north. The trouble had names: abolitionists, underground railroad, slave rebellions, words that were spoken in whispers among the enslaved and in angry shouts among the masters. Sarah listened to all of it, silent and invisible, as she refilled water glasses and cleared plates. She was 17 years old the day everything changed. It was August, the hottest month in a hot year. The cotton was ready for picking, and everyone who could work was in the fields from sunup to sundown. Ruth had been feeling poorly for weeks. A cough that wouldn't quit, a fever that came and went, but there was no such thing as sick leave when you were enslaved. You worked until you dropped, and then you faced punishment for dropping. Sarah had begged the overseer, a red-faced man named Dawson, to let her mother rest for just one day. She had knelt in front of him, something she swore she'd never do, and pleaded. He had laughed and told her that if Ruth couldn't work, she was useless, and useless slaves got sold south to the sugar plantations, where the life expectancy was 3 years. So Ruth went to the fields. Sarah was in the house, polishing silver in the dining room, when she heard the commotion, shouts from outside, the sound of running feet. She dropped the serving spoon she was holding and ran to the window. A crowd had gathered near the cotton fields. Even from a distance, she could see someone lying on the ground. Her heart knew before her mind did. She ran. Out the back door, across the lawn, her feet flying over grass that the enslaved weren't supposed to walk on. No one stopped her. Maybe they knew it was already too late. Ruth lay in the red dirt between the cotton rows, her chest heaving, her face grey. The other field hands stood in a circle, their faces carefully blank, because showing emotion was dangerous. Dawson stood over Ruth with his arms crossed, shaking his head like she was a horse that had gone lame. "Mama!" Sarah dropped to her knees beside her mother, cradling her head. "Mama, I'm here." Ruth's eyes focused on her daughter's face. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Sarah leaned closer. "Don't let them break you," Ruth whispered. "Promise me, baby girl, don't let them. What is the meaning of this?" Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood at the edge of the field, her pale blue dress spotless, her parasol casting a shadow across her face. She looked at the scene with the irritation of someone whose afternoon had been inconveniently interrupted. "This woman collapsed, Mistress Fairmont," Dawson said, as if reporting on weather conditions. "Can't seem to get her up." Margaret walked closer, her shoes leaving small prints in the dirt. She looked down at Ruth with those cold blue eyes, and Sarah saw something in them that made her blood freeze. Not concern, not even anger, just calculation. "She's been lagging for weeks," Margaret said. "I've seen the reports, picking less each day, slowing down the whole line." "She's sick," Sarah said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. "She needs to rest. Please, Mistress, just let her rest." Margaret's gaze shifted to Sarah, and for a moment something flickered in those blue eyes. Surprise, maybe, that a house slave would speak without being spoken to. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. "Sick." Margaret repeated the word like it tasted bad. "No, Sarah. She's lazy. There's a difference. And laziness is a disease that spreads if it's not treated." "No," Sarah started, but Dawson grabbed her arm and hauled her back. Margaret gestured to 2 of the male field hands. "Take her to the oak. 20 lashes. Perhaps that will cure what ails her. The world seemed to tilt. Sarah heard someone screaming and realized it was her own voice. She fought against Dawson's grip, but he was twice her size and strong from years of controlling people who had no choice but to be controlled. They dragged Ruth toward the oak tree on the rise. She couldn't walk on her own, so they had to carry her, her feet leaving tracks in the red dirt. The other slaves were forced to follow, to form the circle of witnesses. Sarah was dragged along too, still fighting, still screaming. Margaret walked behind them all, her parasol twirling slowly, her face serene as a portrait. At the oak, they tied Ruth's hands to a low branch. She couldn't even stand properly, so she hung there, her knees buckled, her head bowed. The August sun beat down through the leaves, making patterns of light and shadow on her back. Margaret stood to the side. Dawson offered her the whip, and she took it. Sarah would remember this moment for the rest of her life, the way Margaret's fingers closed around the leather handle, the way she tested its weight with a small flick of her wrist, the way she smiled, just a little, just at the corners of her mouth, before she raised her arm. The first lash fell with a crack that seemed to split the air itself. Ruth's body jerked, but she didn't cry out. She had too much pride for that, even now. Margaret brought the whip down again, and again, and again. By the 10th lash, Ruth's dress was torn open, her back a mess of blood and torn flesh. By the 15th, she was no longer moving. By the 20th, Sarah had stopped screaming and started counting each strike, counting each moment that passed, counting the debt that was being written in her mother's blood. When it was over, Margaret handed the whip back to Dawson without a word. Her hands were steady, there was no blood on her pale blue dress. She turned and walked back toward the house, her parasol twirling, as if she had done nothing more remarkable than prune a rose bush. They cut Ruth down and carried her back to the quarters. Sarah stayed with her through the night, washing her wounds with water and tears, singing the old songs in a voice that shook. But Ruth never opened her eyes again. Her breathing grew shallower and shallower, until just before dawn, it stopped altogether. Sarah sat in the small cabin and felt something inside her die with her mother. The girl who had believed in survival, in keeping her head down, in enduring, that girl was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who had counted every lash and would never forget the number, someone who understood now what her mother had meant about not letting them break you. They couldn't break what was already dead inside, and in the ashes of that death, something else was being born, something patient, something that could wait, something that remembered every detail of a pale blue dress and cold blue eyes, and the way a woman smiled before she raised a whip. Sarah buried her mother in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation. There were no markers, no names, just mounds of red Georgia earth. She stood there alone after everyone else had gone back to work, and she made a promise to the ground. "I learned from her, Mama," she whispered. "I learned." And the oak tree on the rise seemed to listen, its branches moving in a wind that wasn't there. The months after Ruth's death passed in a blur of routine and rage. Sarah returned to the main house, to her duties, to the careful invisibility that kept her alive. But something fundamental had changed. Where before she had moved through the Fairmont house like a ghost, trying not to be seen, now she moved like a shadow, studying everything it touched. She learned Margaret's patterns with the precision of a hunter learning prey. The exact time she woke each morning, 6:30, never earlier, never later. The way she preferred her hair arranged on Tuesdays versus Thursdays. The fact that she took laudanum for her headaches, 3 drops in warm milk, and that those headaches came more frequently when Master Edmund was away in Savannah, which was most of the time. Sarah learned which floorboards in the second-floor hallway creaked and which ones didn't. She learned where Margaret kept her jewelry, her correspondence, her money. She learned that Margaret wrote letters to her sister in Charleston, complaining about the cost of maintaining slaves, the rumors of northern interference, the way the world was changing in ways that threatened everything their fathers had built. They don't understand, Margaret wrote in one letter that Sarah read while supposedly cleaning the desk. These abolitionists in their Boston parlors know nothing of managing an estate, of maintaining order among an inferior race. Someone must be the strong hand. Someone must ensure civilization doesn't collapse into chaos. Sarah replaced the letter exactly as she'd found it, her hands steady despite the fury boiling in her chest. Inferior race. The words echoed in her mind as she continued her work, dusting furniture worth more than a human life, arranging flowers in vases that could have fed a family for a month. She began to notice other things, too. The way the plantation was changing as 1842 turned into 1843. Whispers among the field hands about slaves escaping to the north, news that traveled through the invisible network of the enslaved. A successful rebellion in Virginia, quickly crushed. A conductor on the Underground Railroad caught and hanged in South Carolina. Each piece of news brought tighter restrictions, more patrols, increased brutality as the masters felt their control slipping. Edmund Fairmont spent even less time at the plantation now, his business interests apparently more urgent than ever. When he did return, he and Margaret argued behind closed doors. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. Margaret's voice rising, sharp as broken glass. Edmund's lower, placating, then angry. Doors slamming, long silences. Money was tighter. Sarah could tell by the way Margaret started examining household accounts more closely, by the cheaper cuts of meat that appeared at dinner, by the fact that 2 field hands were sold in October to a trader heading to Mississippi. The sales broke up 2 families. Children were torn from parents, screaming. Margaret watched from the veranda with her morning tea, her face expressionless. That night, Sarah lay awake in the small room off the kitchen where she slept. She could hear the sounds of grief drifting from the quarters, low keening that the mourners tried to muffle so it wouldn't disturb the big house. She stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother's words. Don't let them break you. But what if you were already broken? What if the breaking had happened so long ago that you couldn't remember ever being whole? What then? The answer came to her slowly, like dawn creeping across a dark sky. If you were already broken, then you had nothing left to lose, and a person with nothing to lose was the most dangerous thing in the world. Winter came to Georgia, such as winter was in that part of the South. The cotton was picked and baled, the fields lying fallow until spring planting. The pace of work in the house slowed slightly. Margaret spent more time in the parlor, receiving visits from other plantation wives, gossiping about politics and social matters, and the increasing tensions between North and South. "There will be war," one woman said over tea in January. Sarah was serving, as invisible as the wallpaper as she always was. "My husband says it's inevitable. The North won't let us be. Then we'll teach them a lesson they won't forget," Margaret replied, her voice hard. "We'll show them what happens when inferiors try to dictate to their betters." The women all nodded, sipping their tea from porcelain cups that Sarah had washed that morning. They spoke about states' rights and property rights and constitutional principles, using elaborate language to dress up the simple truth that they wanted to keep owning people and would kill to do it. Sarah poured more tea and said nothing, but she listened, and she remembered. Spring of 1843 brought unusual weather. Heavy rains in March flooded parts of the cotton fields. A late frost in April killed some of the newly planted seedlings. Edmund came home more frequently, his face drawn with worry, his conversations with Margaret growing more heated. Sarah overheard one argument in May, standing outside the study door where she'd been sent to dust. "We're mortgaged to the hilt, Margaret. If this year's crop fails, then we'll manage. We always do. We'll sell more land, more slaves. We've sold 12 already. Any more and we won't have enough hands to work the fields. The other planters are in the same position. The market's flooded. Prices are down. Then we'll economize elsewhere." There is no elsewhere. This whole system is hanging by a thread, and you refuse to see it. What I see, Margaret's voice dropped to something cold and sharp, is a man who's lost his spine. Your father built this plantation from nothing. He understood that strength is the only language these people understand. Kindness is weakness, mercy is death. If you'd remember that. A door slammed. Heavy footsteps approached. Sarah moved quickly, her feather duster suddenly very busy on a nearby table, as Edmund strode past without seeing her. His face was flushed, his jaw tight with anger. That night, Sarah lay awake again, thinking about what she'd heard. The system hanging by a thread. If the plantation was struggling, if the Fairmonts were weakening, then perhaps... But perhaps what? What could she do? She was one woman, owned by people who saw her as property. Even if she ran, where would she go? The patrols were everywhere, and the penalties for running were horrific. She'd seen returned runaways whipped until they couldn't walk, branded, sold south to sugar plantations that were death sentences. No, running wasn't the answer. But staying didn't mean accepting. It didn't mean forgetting, it meant waiting. June brought scorching heat and rumors of trouble in Virginia. A group of enslaved people had poisoned their overseer, though they'd been caught before they could escape. All 15 were hanged, their bodies left to swing for days as a warning. The news spread through the underground network of the enslaved, told in whispers, in glances, in the old songs that carried messages the masters couldn't decode. Margaret tightened discipline on the plantation. Curfews became stricter, passes required for any movement, rations reduced, and the oak tree saw more use than it had in years. Minor infractions that might have earned a scolding now earned the lash. 3 strikes for spilling water, 5 for singing too loudly, 10 for looking a white person in the eye for too long. Sarah watched it all with eyes that had learned to hide everything they felt. She watched and she learned, and she waited for something she couldn't yet name, but could feel approaching like a storm building on the horizon. In July, something changed in Margaret. Sarah noticed it first in small ways. The mistress became more irritable, her headaches more frequent. She spent hours staring out windows, barely speaking. When she did speak, her words were sharp enough to draw blood. One evening, while Sarah was brushing Margaret's hair before bed, the mistress suddenly grabbed her wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her blue eyes fierce in the mirror's reflection. "Do you hate me, Sarah?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "No, mistress." "Liar." Margaret's grip tightened. "I see how you look at me sometimes, when you think I'm not watching. That look your mother had right before." She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. "Right before you killed her." The words hung unspoken between them. Margaret released Sarah's wrist suddenly, turning away from the mirror. "Get out!" Sarah left quickly, her hands shaking only after she'd closed the door behind her. She stood in the hallway, breathing hard, and realized that Margaret knew. On some level, she knew what Sarah was feeling, and instead of fear, Margaret seemed almost curious, as if she wanted to see what Sarah would do. August came again, marking a year since Ruth's death. Sarah woke on the anniversary and felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. She went through her morning routine, helping Margaret dress, arranging her hair, serving breakfast, but everything felt different, sharper, more present. She kept glancing out windows at the oak tree on the rise. From certain angles, she could see marks on its trunk, old scars where bark had grown back over wounds. The tree had witnessed so much suffering, absorbed so much pain, and it still stood, patient and ancient, its roots deep in red Georgia clay. That evening, as Sarah was preparing Margaret's laudanum, she paused with the brown bottle in her hand, 3 drops in warm milk. That was the routine. 3 drops to ease the headaches, to help Margaret sleep. Sarah stood there for a long moment looking at the bottle, thinking about how easy it would be to add more drops. 4, 5, 10. Laudanum was opium in alcohol. Too much could kill. Everyone knew that. Her hand trembled slightly. This was the moment. The choice that couldn't be uncalled once made. In her mind she heard her mother's voice. "Don't let them break you," and Margaret's voice. Someone must be the strong hand. And her own voice, speaking to her mother's grave. "I learned from her." Sarah added exactly 3 drops to the warm milk, no more, no less. Then she carried the glass upstairs to Margaret's bedroom, her face composed, her hands steady. But as she handed Margaret the glass, their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, Sarah saw something flicker in Margaret's blue gaze. Recognition, maybe, or anticipation, as if they were both players in a game whose rules had just changed, even though neither could say exactly how. Margaret drank her laudanum and sent Sarah away, but that night, lying in her small room, Sarah didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of a decision she hadn't yet made, but could feel approaching like thunder on a distant horizon. The oak tree stood outside, patient as always, waiting for whatever came next. Its branches moved in a night breeze that carried the smell of coming rain, and somewhere in the slave quarters, someone began to sing one of the old songs. A song about waiting, about water wearing down stone, about how the longest night always ended with dawn. Sarah listened to that song and knew with absolute certainty that something was about to break. The only question was what and who would survive the breaking. September brought no relief from the heat. The air hung thick and still over Fairmont, pressing down on everything like a hot, wet blanket that couldn't be thrown off. In the fields, the second growth of cotton struggled in soil, depleted by decades of the same crop, same methods, same exhausted earth, giving less and less each year. The enslaved people who worked those fields moved like ghosts through the rows, their bodies present but their spirits somewhere far away. In the main house, Margaret grew stranger. She lost weight, her cheekbones becoming more prominent, her eyes taking on a feverish brightness. She spent hours walking the plantation at odd times, early morning when the mist still clung to the ground, late afternoon when the sun was brutally hot, even at night sometimes, her white nightgown ghostly in the moonlight. Sarah would watch from windows, tracking her mistress's movements with the focus of someone studying an enemy's patterns. Because that's what Margaret was now. Sarah had finally admitted to herself, not a mistress to be served, not even a person to be feared, an enemy. The enemy, the one who had taken everything that mattered and smiled while doing it. The admission was liberating in a strange way. It clarified things, made the path forward, whatever that path might be, easier to see. Edmund came home in early September and immediately noticed the change in his wife. Sarah watched their reunion from her position in the foyer, pretending to arrange flowers while actually noting every detail of the interaction. Edmund's concern was genuine, she thought. He reached for Margaret's hand, touched her face gently, asked questions in a voice that held real worry. Margaret pulled away from all of it. "I'm fine. Just tired of this heat. Tired of this place. Then we'll go to Charleston for a month. Get you away from—" "I'm not running away from my own home." Margaret's voice turned sharp. "Unlike some people, I don't abandon my responsibilities when things become difficult." The words hit their target. Edmund's face tightened. "That's not fair, Margaret. Isn't it? You spend more time in Savannah than here, leaving me to manage everything, the house, the fields, the—" She gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the quarters, toward the people whose labor built everything the Fairmonts owned, all of it. "Because someone has to save what's left of our finances. The tariffs are killing us. Cotton prices keep falling. If we don't diversify our investments—" "I don't want to hear about finances." Margaret turned away from him. "I want you here. I want things to be the way they used to be." But they both knew that was impossible. Whatever used to be meant the easy confidence of the planter class, the certainty of their world and their place in it, was crumbling. Sarah could see it in every argument, every worried glance, every letter that arrived talking about political tensions and economic pressures, and the growing sense that a reckoning was coming. That night, Sarah heard them arguing again. Their voices carried through the house, though she couldn't make out specific words, just the tone. Edmund trying to be reasonable, Margaret growing more and more agitated. A crash, something thrown maybe. Then silence. In the morning, Edmund was gone again. "Savannah," Margaret said, her face like stone. "Always Savannah." Sarah helped her dress in silence, noting the way Margaret's hands shook slightly as she put on her jewelry, the way her eyes looked too bright, almost glassy. "He doesn't understand," Margaret said suddenly, speaking to Sarah, but also to herself, to the mirror, to ghosts that only she could see. None of them understand what it takes to maintain order, what it costs. She turned to look directly at Sarah. "But you understand, don't you? You see what has to be done." Sarah kept her face neutral. "Yes, mistress." "Do you?" Margaret stepped closer, studying Sarah's face like she was looking for something hidden there. "Sometimes I think you're the only one who truly sees, the only one who knows what I carry." She laughed, a strange, bitter sound. "Isn't that ironic? That the only person who understands is—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the word hung between them anyway. "A slave." Margaret turned away abruptly. "Go check on the evening meal. I want chicken tonight. Tell cook to use the good china. We're going to have dinner like civilized people, even if the world is falling apart." Sarah left the room and went downstairs, her mind working through what she'd just witnessed. Margaret was unraveling. The cracks that had started months ago were widening. Whatever held the mistress together, pride, duty, the certainty of her position, was failing. And an enemy who was falling apart was an enemy who could be toppled. The thought came clearly, coldly. Sarah reached the kitchen and delivered her instructions to Bessie, the cook, a woman of 60 who had survived 4 owners and learned to see everything while appearing to see nothing. "Chicken on the good china," Bessie repeated, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face. "Mistress feeling grand tonight." "Mistress is feeling something," Sarah said quietly. Bessie nodded slowly. She moved closer, lowering her voice. "You be careful, child. I seen that look on white folk before. When they're scared and angry and don't know where to put it, they get dangerous then. Strike out at whatever's close." "I know." "Do you?" Bessie's hand reached out, touched Sarah's arm briefly. "Your mama, God rest her, she never learned to bend. She was strong as that oak tree, and just as easy to break against. You got some of her in you. I see it, but you got something else too, something patient, like deep water." Sarah met Bessie's eyes. In them she saw decades of survival, of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to wait. And she saw recognition. Bessie knew, maybe not the specifics, but the essence. She knew that Sarah had crossed some invisible line and wasn't coming back. "Just be careful," Bessie said again. "That's all I'm saying. The ones that wait too long drown, but the ones that move too soon get caught. You got to feel the current, know when to swim." "Yes, ma'am." That night, Margaret ate her chicken dinner alone in the formal dining room, served on porcelain plates that had come from England before the Revolution. Sarah served each course, moving silently, efficiently, invisibly. She watched Margaret push food around her plate without eating much, watched her drink 3 glasses of wine instead, watched her eyes grow more distant with each glass. After dinner, Margaret didn't go to bed. Instead, she walked out onto the back veranda, standing at the railing and looking out toward the fields, toward the quarters, toward the oak tree barely visible in the gathering darkness. Sarah cleaned up the dining room, helped Bessie in the kitchen, then went to her small room off the pantry. But she didn't undress. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and waited, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Footsteps above, doors closing. The old building creaking as it cooled from the day's heat. Around midnight, she heard Margaret come inside, heard her on the stairs, heard her bedroom door close. Sarah waited another hour, then slipped out of her room and moved through the dark house with the confidence of someone who knew every floorboard, every corner, every shadow. She went to the study where Edmund kept his papers. The door was never locked. Why would it be, with only slaves in the house at night, and slaves couldn't read anyway, except Sarah could. Her mother had taught her in secret, lessons conducted by firelight in their cabin, using scraps of newspaper and bits of charcoal. It was illegal, punishable by whipping or worse, but Ruth had insisted. "They own your body," Ruth had said. "Don't let them own your mind too." Sarah lit a single candle and began going through Edmund's papers. She found ledgers detailing the plantation's finances, debts to banks in Savannah, mortgages on the land, the declining value of cotton, the costs of maintaining the enslaved workforce, food, clothing, the occasional medical care that was cheaper than buying a replacement. Everything calculated down to the penny, human beings reduced to numbers in a book. She found correspondence with other planters, all of them worried about the same things: political tensions, tariffs. The Underground Railroad, abolitionists. Each letter expressed the same fundamental anxiety. Their world was ending, and they didn't know how to stop it. Sarah found one letter dated August 15, 1843, from a planter in South Carolina. "We must stand firm, Edmund. These Yankees think they can dictate our way of life, destroy our property rights, end the institution that built this nation. They speak of morality while wearing cotton grown by our hands, eating sugar harvested by our labor. If it comes to war, and I believe it will, we must show them that the South will not be subjugated. Better to burn it all down than surrender to their tyranny." Sarah read those words by candlelight and felt something cold settle in her chest. Better to burn it all down. They would rather destroy everything than give freedom to the people they enslaved. The logic was insane, but it was real. These men would kill and die to preserve their right to own other human beings. She replaced the papers exactly as she'd found them and returned to her room. But sleep didn't come. She lay in the darkness and thought about Margaret upstairs, about Edmund in Savannah, about the 200 enslaved people in the quarters, about the oak tree waiting under the stars, and she thought about her mother's last words: "Don't let them break you." But what if breaking was the only way to become free? What if you had to shatter completely to rebuild yourself into something new? The next week passed in a strange, suspended tension. Margaret grew more erratic, her mood swinging wildly from manic energy to deep lethargy. She would spend entire days in her room, refusing to see anyone, then suddenly appear in the evening, demanding elaborate meals or insisting on inspecting the quarters at odd hours. The enslaved people on the plantation could sense something coming. Sarah saw it in their faces, in the way they moved more carefully, spoke more quietly. Animals knew when a storm was approaching. Enslaved people, whose survival depended on reading the moods of their masters, knew even better. In the third week of September, two things happened that changed everything. First, news arrived that a group of enslaved people on a neighboring plantation had been caught planning an escape. 15 people, including children. They were trying to reach the Underground Railroad station that rumor said existed somewhere near Augusta, but someone had informed another enslaved person, desperate or scared or broken, and they'd been caught before they reached the property line. The punishment was swift and public. All 15 were brought back and whipped in front of the assembled enslaved populations of 3 plantations. Then they were sold, families separated, parents torn from children, sold to different traders heading to different states. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Escape was impossible. Hope was a luxury no one could afford. Sarah was forced to attend as part of the Fairmont household. She stood in the crowd of witnesses and watched the whippings with a face that showed nothing. But inside, she counted. She counted every lash, every scream, every child torn from a mother's arms. She counted it all and added it to the ledger she was keeping in her heart. The second thing that happened was that Margaret started visiting the oak tree. Sarah first noticed it on a morning in late September. She was bringing Margaret her breakfast tray when she saw through the window that her mistress was standing under the oak, still in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, just standing there, staring up into the branches. By the time Sarah went outside with a shawl, because a mistress couldn't be seen in dishabille, even on her own property, Margaret had returned to the house. But she went back the next day, and the day after that, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at dusk, always standing in the same spot, looking up into the branches as if searching for something she'd lost there. "What do you think she's looking for?" Bessie asked one evening as she and Sarah prepared dinner. "Herself, maybe," Sarah said quietly, "or what she used to be before." She trailed off, but Bessie understood. Before she became what she is now. October arrived with cooler weather and harder edges. The cotton was being picked for the final time that season, the last harvest before winter. The fields were nearly empty now, just scattered white bolls clinging to brown plants. In a few weeks, the field hands would burn the old plants and prepare the soil for next year, assuming there was a next year, assuming the plantation survived another season of falling prices and mounting debts. Edmund came home for a week in mid-October. He and Margaret had what sounded like a final confrontation. Raised voices, things breaking, a scream that might have been anger or might have been anguish. When Edmund left 3 days later, his face was drawn and grey. He didn't say goodbye to Margaret, just got in his carriage and rode away toward Savannah without looking back. Margaret watched him go from an upstairs window. Sarah was in the room, making the bed, and she saw the expression on her mistress's face. Not sadness, not even anger, just emptiness, as if whatever had held Margaret together had finally, completely broken. "He's not coming back," Margaret said, still looking out the window at the empty drive. "Is he?" Sarah didn't answer. There was no good answer. Edmund might come back. He might not. Either way, something fundamental had shifted. The marriage, like the plantation, like the whole southern way of life, was collapsing. The only question was how fast and how violently it would fall. That night, Margaret didn't take her laudanum. She sent Sarah away without explanation. Sarah went to her room but didn't undress. She sat on her bed and waited, listening. Around 2 a.m, she heard the back door open and close, footsteps on the veranda, then on the grass. Sarah went to the kitchen window and looked out. Margaret was walking toward the fields, toward the oak tree, dressed in a dark cloak, a lantern in her hand. She moved like a woman in a trance, or a woman who had finally made a decision she'd been avoiding for a long time. Sarah watched until the lantern's light reached the oak and stopped there. She watched for 10 minutes, 15, 20. The light didn't move. Whatever Margaret was doing under that tree, she was doing it alone, in the middle of the night, in the place where she had inflicted so much pain. Sarah turned from the window and began to think, really think, about timing and opportunity, about patience and revenge, about her mother's voice and Margaret's cruelty and the oak tree that had witnessed everything. About what it meant to learn from someone who had taught you to become what they feared most. The storm was coming. Sarah could feel it in the air, in the tension that made her skin prickle, in the way the wind had shifted direction and was now blowing from the north, carrying the scent of rain and change and endings. The only question left was, when the storm broke, would she be ready? The last week of October turned cold. Not the bitter cold of northern winters, but the damp chill that settled into bones and wouldn't leave. In the quarters, people huddled around fires and wrapped themselves in threadbare blankets. In the main house, Margaret ordered fires lit in every room, then complained they made the air too dry, then ordered them put out, then demanded them lit again. Sarah watched her mistress deteriorate with the careful attention of a physician observing a fatal disease. Margaret barely ate now. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had been slender and was now gaunt. Her skin took on a translucent quality, like paper held up to light. But her eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to grow brighter as her body weakened. She went to the oak tree every night now, sometimes twice. Sarah knew, because she tracked the mud on Margaret's shoes, the bits of bark that clung to her cloak, the way she came back to the house with leaves in her hair and scratches on her hands, as if she'd been grasping at branches. "She's losing her mind," Dawson, the overseer, said to Sarah one morning when he came to the house with reports on the harvest. He said it casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Master Edmund should have taken her away when he had the chance. Woman's got brain fever or something." Sarah said nothing. She never spoke to Dawson unless absolutely necessary. His casual cruelty, his easy violence, his complete indifference to the suffering he caused. He was Margaret in a different form, just without the pretense of refinement. But Dawson was right about one thing. Margaret was losing herself to something. Whether it was guilt or madness, or the simple exhaustion of being what she had made herself become, Sarah couldn't say, and didn't particularly care. What mattered was that Margaret was weak now, vulnerable. The opening Sarah had been waiting for was finally appearing. On November 1st, Margaret summoned Sarah to her bedroom in the middle of the afternoon. The room was dark, curtains drawn against the grey daylight. Margaret sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a shawl despite the stuffiness of the room. "Tell me about your mother," Margaret said without preamble. Sarah stood in the doorway, her heart suddenly pounding. "Mistress, your mother, Ruth, tell me about her. What she was like before." Margaret waved a hand vaguely. "Before everything." The question was so unexpected, so bizarre, that Sarah couldn't immediately formulate a response. Margaret had never asked about any enslaved person's life, had never acknowledged that they had lives or thoughts or feelings beyond their function as property. "I want to know," Margaret insisted. "I need to know." "Why?" The question came out before Sarah could stop it, a violation of every rule, every protocol. Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Because I dream about her. Every night I see her face. I see all their faces, everyone who stood under that tree. And I need to know if—" She stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "I need to know if I'm haunted by people or just by ghosts. If you understand the difference." Sarah understood. Margaret wanted to know if the people she had tortured had been real to begin with, or if she had somehow convinced herself they were less than human. If the guilt that was clearly eating her alive was justified or just weakness. "She was real," Sarah said quietly. "She was my mother. She sang to me when I was frightened. She taught me to read even though it was forbidden. She worked herself to death in your fields and never complained. She was the strongest person I've ever known. And you killed her." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah had just signed her own death warrant. You didn't speak to a white woman like that. You didn't accuse. You didn't dare to suggest that a mistress had committed murder, even though everyone knew that's exactly what it was. But Margaret just nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." She looked up at Sarah, and there were tears in those cold blue eyes. "I killed her. I've killed so many of them, with the whip, with the heat, with the work that breaks bodies and spirits. I've killed them, and I called it necessary. I called it order. I called it my duty." She stood up, moving like a much older woman, and walked to the window. "Do you want to kill me, Sarah? Tell me the truth. I won't punish you for honesty. Not anymore. I'm so tired of lies." Sarah could have said no, could have fallen back on the safe script of deference and denial. But something in this moment demanded truth. Margaret was offering her one, the first honest thing that had ever passed between them. So Sarah gave one back. "Yes." Margaret nodded again, still looking out the window. "How would you do it? If you could? If there were no consequences?" "Under the oak tree," Sarah said, her voice steady now, certain. "The same way you killed her. 20 lashes. Exactly 20. So you'd know. So you'd understand what it felt like. To be helpless." "Yes." to be nothing but pain and the will to endure it. Yes, to be less than human in someone else's eyes. Yes, Margaret turned from the window to face Sarah directly. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Not the cruel smile Sarah remembered from that terrible day. Something else, something that might have been relief. Then do it. Sarah stared at her mistress. What? Do it. Take me to the tree. Tie me there. Make me feel what I made her feel, what I made all of them feel. Margaret's voice grew stronger, more urgent. I can't carry this anymore. I can't live with what I've done, but I can't change it either. The only thing left is to understand it, to feel it, to become what I made them become. You're insane, probably. Margaret laughed, and it was the saddest sound Sarah had ever heard. But I'm also serious. Take me to the tree tonight after everyone's asleep. No one will know. No one will see. Just you and me, and that damned oak that's seen too much already. She grabbed Sarah's hands, and her grip was desperate, fierce. Please, I'm begging you, let me feel something other than this emptiness. Let me pay even a fraction of what I owe. Let me... No. Sarah pulled her hands away. This isn't about you and your guilt and your need to feel absolved. This isn't about you at all. Then what is it about? It's about my mother, and every person who died under that tree, and every child sold away from their parents, and every man and woman who lived and died as your property. It's about them, not you. Margaret's face crumpled. Then I'll never be free of this. I'll carry it until I die. This weight, this knowing what I've done. Good, Sarah said coldly. You should carry it. You should feel every ounce of that weight for the rest of your life. That's not punishment. That's just the truth catching up with you. She turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped her. Wait, please. There was something different in her tone now. You're right. It's not about me. But Sarah, if you want vengeance, if you want justice, if you want anything, take it. I won't stop you. I won't even resist. I owe you that much at least. Sarah looked back at the woman who had destroyed her life. Margaret stood there in her expensive but now disheveled clothes, in her elegant but now empty room, a broken thing that had broken so many others. And Sarah realized that this wasn't the victory she'd imagined. Margaret offering herself up for punishment wasn't justice. It was just another form of control. The mistress deciding when and how to suffer on her own terms in her own time. Even in guilt, even in madness, Margaret was trying to maintain power over the narrative. Real justice wouldn't look like this. Real justice would be something Margaret couldn't control or anticipate or frame as noble suffering. I'll think about it, Sarah said finally, and left the room before Margaret could respond. She went downstairs and outside, needing air, needing to think. She walked toward the quarters, but stopped before reaching them. Instead, she turned toward the oak tree. The tree stood against the grey November sky like a black skeleton. Its leaves were mostly gone now, carpeting the ground in brown and gold. Sarah walked up the rise and stood under the branches, looking up at the thick limbs where so many had been tied, where her mother had hung bleeding and dying. I don't know what to do, she whispered to the tree, to her mother, to whatever force in the universe might be listening. She's giving herself to me, offering herself up, but it feels wrong. It feels like even in this, she's trying to control things, trying to make it about her redemption instead of our pain. The wind stirred the few remaining leaves. In that rustling, Sarah almost thought she heard her mother's voice. You'll know what to do when the time comes. Trust yourself, baby girl. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself remember, not just the horror of that day, but everything before. Her mother singing in their cabin, the way Ruth's hands, despite their roughness, were gentle when they braided Sarah's hair. The lessons by firelight, learning to read, learning to see beyond the narrow confines of their enslaved existence. Her mother's absolute insistence on dignity, on humanity, on refusing to be reduced to what their masters tried to make them. When Sarah opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do, not what Margaret expected, not what anyone would expect, but what needed to be done. She returned to the house and went about her duties for the rest of the day. She served Margaret's dinner, helped her prepare for bed, gave her the laudanum, 3 drops, no more, no less. She said nothing about their earlier conversation. Margaret watched her with questions in her eyes, but didn't speak them aloud. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her room and listened to the house settle into silence. She thought about Bessie's words. You got to feel the current, know when to swim. The current was here now. She could feel it pulling her towards something inevitable. The question was whether she had the courage to let it carry her where it needed to go. Around midnight, she heard the now familiar sound of Margaret leaving her room, going outside. Sarah went to the window and watched the mistress walk toward the oak tree, carrying her lantern. But this time, Sarah didn't just watch. She put on her mother's old shawl, the one she'd kept hidden, the one that still smelled faintly of Ruth, despite the year that had passed. She took a knife from the kitchen, not for violence, but because she might need to cut rope. And she followed Margaret into the darkness, moving quietly, staying in shadow. Margaret stood under the oak tree, her lantern casting wild shadows on the trunk. She wasn't just standing this time. She was tying rope to one of the lower branches. The same branch they'd used for punishments. Her hands fumbled with the knots, unpracticed but determined. Sarah watched from 30 feet away, hidden behind another tree. She watched Margaret finish tying the rope, watched her test its strength, watched her fashion a crude noose at the other end. And Sarah understood. This wasn't about wanting punishment. This was about escape. Margaret wasn't offering herself to Sarah for justice. She was planning to end her own life here, under this tree, as if that would somehow balance the scales of what she'd done. Sarah felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. No, that wasn't how this ended. Margaret didn't get to choose peace while her victims never found any. She didn't get to make her suffering mean something when she'd rendered everyone else's suffering meaningless. Sarah stepped out of the shadows. Stop! Margaret spun around, the lantern swinging wildly. Sarah, I know what you're doing. Sarah walked closer, and I'm not going to let you do it. It's not your choice, isn't it? Sarah was close enough now to see Margaret's face clearly. Tears streaked her cheeks, but there was something like relief in her eyes, relief that she'd been caught, relief that someone was going to stop her. You said I could take vengeance, that you'd give yourself to me, so I'm taking you, but not like this, not on your terms. Then how? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah looked up at the oak tree, at the rope Margaret had tied, at the branches that had witnessed so much, and she felt her mother's presence like a hand on her shoulder, steady and sure. We're going to make you live, Sarah said. We're going to make you carry the weight of what you've done for as long as you draw breath. We're going to make you see every face, remember every name, feel every moment of the pain you caused. Not for one night, not for 20 lashes, for the rest of your life. That's the punishment you've earned. Not death, life. Full awareness of what you are and what you've done. Margaret stared at her. That's crueler than any whip. Yes, Sarah agreed, it is. Because you can't escape it. You can't make it noble. You can't turn your suffering into some kind of redemption story. You just have to live with it. The way we all had to live with what you did to us. Sarah reached up and started untying the rope. Margaret didn't stop her. She just stood there, the lantern shaking in her hands, watching as Sarah destroyed her means of escape. What happens now? Margaret asked when the rope was down. Now? Sarah coiled the rope carefully. Now you go back to the house. You continue living. You continue being the mistress of this plantation for however much longer it lasts. And every day, every single day, you remember who you are and what you've done. You carry it all. That's your punishment. That's your justice. I can't do that. You will. Because the alternative is that I tell everyone what you tried to do tonight, how weak you are, how broken, and they'll lock you away in some asylum where you'll spend the rest of your days in a fog of laudanum and restraints. Is that what you want?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Then you'll live. You'll endure. Just like we had to endure. You'll learn what it means to have no escape, no control, no power over your own suffering. Welcome to the tree, Mistress. You're finally beneath it where you belong." Sarah turned and walked away, carrying the rope, leaving Margaret standing alone in the circle of lantern light under the oak tree. She didn't look back. She walked steadily through the darkness toward the house, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, feeling something inside her that she hadn't felt since Ruth died. Not happiness, not even satisfaction, but a kind of terrible clarity. A certainty that she had done what needed to be done, not what anger demanded or what vengeance promised, but what justice, real justice, required. Behind her, she heard Margaret begin to cry, not the soft tears of earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. The sound carried across the dark fields, raw and broken. Sarah kept walking. Let Margaret cry. Let her feel the weight of it all. Let her carry it into dawn and beyond. Let her live with what she'd made herself become. That was the real punishment, not death under the tree. Life beneath its shadow forever. November deepened into early winter. The plantation took on the grey quality of things dying slowly. The cotton was all harvested now, the fields bare and waiting. Enslaved people who had worked themselves to near death through the growing season now faced a different kind of hardship. Less work meant less to keep their minds occupied, more time to feel the cold, to remember what had been lost, to wonder how much longer this life would continue. In the main house, a strange new routine established itself. Margaret didn't try to hang herself again. She did exactly as Sarah had told her. She lived. She continued being Mistress of Fairmont, continued managing the household and overseeing the plantation, but something fundamental had broken in her, and everyone could see it. She moved through her days like a ghost inhabiting her own life. She gave orders mechanically, ate without tasting, spoke in a flat voice that held none of her former fire or cruelty. The other plantation owners' wives who came to visit noticed the change and whispered about it. "Poor Margaret," they said. "The stress of managing everything alone has worn her down. Perhaps Edmund should come home more often." But Edmund didn't come home. November passed into December with no word from Savannah. The household bills went unpaid. The usual Christmas preparations, gifts for the house slaves, extra rations for the field hands, the appearance of magnanimous generosity that helped maintain the fiction of benevolent ownership, didn't happen. Everyone simply continued in the grey routine, marking time. Sarah watched it all with the careful attention she'd developed. She watched Margaret decline further, watched Dawson take more control of day-to-day operations, watched the other enslaved people navigate the strange, new dynamic where their mistress was present but somehow absent at the same time. And Sarah realized something important. The power structure of the plantation was fracturing. Margaret's authority had been absolute, built on her willingness to be more cruel than anyone expected a refined lady to be. But now, with that willingness gone, with her spirit broken, her power was evaporating. Dawson sensed it and was moving to fill the vacuum. The other white people on the plantation, the few remaining overseers, the house servants who were allowed slightly more freedom than field hands, they all sensed it too. A storm was coming. Not the metaphorical kind Sarah had felt building for months, but a real reorganization of power that would determine what Fairmont became in whatever time it had left. On December 10th, Edmund returned unexpectedly. His carriage arrived in the late afternoon, mud splattered from the roads. He climbed out, looking older than when he'd left, his face lined with worry, his clothes rumpled from travel. Sarah was in the parlor when he arrived. She watched through the window as he stood in the drive for a long moment, looking up at the house as if gathering courage to enter his own home. Then he climbed the steps and came inside. "Where is my wife?" he asked Sarah without preamble. "In her room, Master Edmund. She's been there since this morning." He nodded, not really hearing, and climbed the stairs. Sarah heard him knock on Margaret's door, heard it open, heard their voices, though not the words. The conversation was brief. Then Edmund came back downstairs, his face carefully neutral. "Prepare the study. I need to meet with Dawson and the other overseers. We have matters to discuss." Sarah prepared the study as ordered. She brought whiskey, glasses, paper and ink for note-taking, and when the men gathered, Edmund, Dawson and 2 other white men who helped manage the plantation, Sarah stood in her customary position in the corner, ready to serve, supposedly invisible, but she listened. And what she heard confirmed her suspicions. "Gentlemen, I'll be direct," Edmund said, his voice heavy. "We're bankrupt. The banks in Savannah have called in the loans. The tariffs have made cotton worthless. Our expenses exceed our income by thousands of dollars per year. We have 3 options: sell the plantation entirely, sell off portions of the enslaved workforce to reduce costs, or try to hold on until cotton prices recover." "If they recover," Dawson said. "The way things are going with all this abolitionist agitation, cotton may never be profitable again." "That's a northern fantasy," one of the other overseers said. "Cotton built this country. It'll survive this temporary setback." "Temporary or not, we need to make decisions now." Edmund poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. Selling the plantation would mean admitting defeat, moving to the city, living off whatever capital we could salvage. It would destroy Margaret. "Margaret is already destroyed," Dawson said bluntly. "Begging your pardon, Master Edmund, but your wife is not well. Everyone can see it. She barely functions. Whatever's wrong with her, it's not getting better." Edmund's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Then what do you suggest?" "Sell off the field hands. Keep just enough for basic maintenance. Focus on diversifying crops, some tobacco, some corn, things that don't require as much labor. Reduce our exposure to cotton prices." "That would mean selling nearly 100 people. It would mean surviving," Dawson said. "The alternative is losing everything." The discussion continued for another hour. Sarah stood in her corner and felt her hands go cold. 100 people. 100 lives sold away, families torn apart, people sent to God knows where to work themselves to death in someone else's fields. All because of mathematics, because of ledgers that didn't balance, because human beings had been turned into assets that could be liquidated when economically necessary. When the meeting ended and the men filed out, Sarah caught Dawson's eye for just a moment. He smiled slightly, and she saw in that smile what he was thinking. Chaos was opportunity. In the disruption of selling off the workforce, in the confusion of the plantation's collapse, there would be chances to profit, to take more control, to carve out a larger piece of whatever remained. Sarah went upstairs to check on Margaret. She knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an answer. The old rules of deference had relaxed in the past month, neither of them quite acknowledging why. Margaret sat by the window in the gathering darkness, not bothering to light a lamp. She looked at Sarah with eyes that held recognition but little else. "He wants to sell them, doesn't he?" "Yes, mistress. 100 people, 100 lives I'm responsible for." Margaret's voice was flat, factual. "Add them to all the others. Add them to the ledger of everything I've destroyed. You could stop it." "How? We have no money, no options. It's either sell the slaves or lose everything." "You could free them." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at Sarah as if she'd suggested burning the house down. "Free them, that's impossible." "Why? You own them. You could sign papers, file them with the county, declare them free. All of them. The whole plantation." "Edmund would never. Edmund doesn't have to agree. In Georgia law, property owners can manumit their slaves if they choose. You'd destroy the plantation's value, but the plantation's already dying. At least this way, you'd save the people." Margaret looked out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. You've thought about this every day since you tried to hang yourself. This is your revenge, isn't it? Not 20 lashes under the tree. This, destroying everything my family built, everything my father left me, making me the woman who ended the Fairmont legacy. No, Sarah said quietly. This is your chance to do one good thing before you die. One thing that might balance even a fraction of the evil you've done. You wanted to understand what it felt like to be helpless, to be powerless. Free your slaves and you'll find out. You'll be nothing. No money, no property, no status. You'll be as close to what we've been as a white woman can get. Margaret turned to look at Sarah directly. In the dim light, her face looked ancient, carved from something harder than flesh. You really have learned from me, haven't you? How to find the cruelest possible mercy, how to make punishment look like salvation. Maybe. Or maybe I learned that real justice isn't about revenge. It's about breaking cycles, ending the evil so it can't continue. You think freeing 200 people will end slavery? No. But it will save 200 people. That's enough. Margaret stood slowly, moving like every joint hurt. She walked to her writing desk and sat down. For a long moment she just stared at the blank paper in front of her. Then she picked up a pen. I don't know the legal language. I do, Sarah said. She'd read enough of Edmund's papers, enough legal documents discussing the transfer and manumission of enslaved people to understand the required phrasing. I'll tell you what to write. Over the next hour, by lamplight, Sarah dictated and Margaret wrote. The legal declaration of manumission for all enslaved persons held at Fairmont Plantation, their names listed one by one, or as many as Margaret could remember, with Sarah filling in the ones she couldn't. The formal renunciation of ownership, the grant of freedom, immediate and unconditional. When it was finished, Margaret signed her name at the bottom. Her hand shook, but the signature was clear. There, she said, the Fairmont legacy, ended by my own hand. My father would be ashamed. Your father was a monster, Sarah said. You should be ashamed of him, not worried about his approval. Margaret looked up, and for the first time in weeks, there was something like fire in her eyes. Not the old cruelty, but something fiercer, anger maybe, or clarity. What happens now? Now we file this with the county clerk. Make it official, before Edmund or Dawson can stop it. They'll try to have it overturned, declare me incompetent, say I was coerced. Probably, but the attempt will take time, and in that time people can run, can reach the north, can disappear into places where they can't be easily reclaimed. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she did something Sarah didn't expect. She stood and pulled a heavy wooden box from under her bed. Inside was money, bills and coins, more than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Take it. It's everything I've saved over the years, hidden from Edmund. It's not much by plantation standards, but it's enough to help people get where they need to go. Enough for bribes, for food, for transportation. Take it and distribute it. Sarah stared at the money. This was real. This was actually happening. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not out of guilt. Not just to punish yourself. Why? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, in a way Sarah had never heard from her. Because you were right. I can't escape what I've done. I can't make it mean something by dying dramatically under that tree, but maybe I can stop adding to it. Maybe I can end my part of this evil, even if the evil itself continues. That's not redemption. It's not even justice. It's just the only thing left I can do that isn't more harm. Sarah took the box. Their hands brushed in the transfer, and neither pulled away. For just a moment, they were two women in a room, united by the shared understanding of what was about to happen and what it would cost. What will you do? Sarah asked. After? When the plantation is gone and you have nothing? Margaret smiled, and it was the saddest thing Sarah had ever seen. I'll live. like you told me to. I'll carry the weight. I'll remember every face. I'll endure. That's the punishment, remember? Life beneath the tree's shadow. Forever. Sarah left the room with the manumission papers and the box of money. She went downstairs and out of the house, moving quickly now, purposefully. She went to the quarters and found Bessie first. "Gather the others," Sarah said quietly. "Everyone. Tell them to come to the oak tree in an hour. Tell them things are about to change, and tell them to be ready to run." Bessie's old eyes widened. "Child, what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" The old woman studied Sarah's face, then nodded slowly. "Your mama would be proud, scared for you, but proud." "I know." Sarah returned to the house to prepare for what came next. She knew Edmund and Dawson would fight this. She knew there would be legal battles, attempts to reclaim the freed people, violence probably. But she also knew that once the word spread, once 200 enslaved people knew they had papers declaring them free, nothing would stop them from running, from scattering into the darkness like seeds blown by a wind that had finally changed direction. She looked out the window at the oak tree on the rise. Its bare branches stood black against the early evening sky. "Tomorrow," she thought, "tomorrow I'll tell them all under that tree. In the place of so much pain, we'll plant the seed of freedom, not justice exactly, not revenge, but something better, something her mother would have called hope." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah felt something other than rage or grief or the cold patience of planned vengeance. She felt the future opening up like a door she'd never thought to see. The night of December 11th, 1843, would be remembered in whispers for generations. Not in history books. Enslaved people rarely made it into those official records, but in the oral traditions, in the stories passed down through families who survived and escaped and eventually found freedom, that night became legend. Sarah stood under the oak tree as the enslaved people of Fairmont gathered, all 200 of them, or close enough. They came quietly, confused but obedient, because that's what survival had taught them. They formed a circle around the tree, their faces illuminated by torches and lanterns, their expressions wary. Dawson had tried to stop the gathering. He'd confronted Sarah as she walked toward the tree, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, calling an assembly without permission. Sarah had simply shown him the signed manumission papers. His face had gone white, then red with rage. He'd grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. But Margaret had appeared then, still in her dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders like a madwoman's. "Let her go, Dawson. It's done. They're free. Master Edmund will never—" "Master Edmund is not here. I am, and I have freed them. If you touch Sarah again, I will see you prosecuted for assault on a free woman." It was the first time in weeks that Margaret had sounded like herself. Dawson had backed away, his face twisted with fury. But he'd let Sarah go. He'd retreated to the house, no doubt to send word to Edmund in Savannah, to begin the legal challenges that everyone knew were coming. But for this moment, for this night, the people gathered under the oak tree were free. Sarah held up the papers. The crowd fell silent, every eye on her. "Mistress Fairmont has signed legal documents declaring all of you free," Sarah said, her voice carrying in the cold night air. "Immediate and unconditional manumission. You are no longer enslaved. You are no longer property. You are free." The silence that followed was total. 200 people trying to process words that seemed impossible. Free. How could they be free? Freedom wasn't something that just happened, wasn't something that masters gave. Freedom was what you died trying to achieve, what got people sold south, what got families torn apart. "I know you don't believe it," Sarah continued. "I barely believe it myself, but the papers are legal. They've been signed and witnessed. Tomorrow we'll file them with the county clerk. But tonight we need to start moving, because Master Edmund will come back. Because there are people who will try to overturn this, because freedom on paper doesn't mean safety. Not yet. An old man named Joseph stepped forward. He'd been at Fairmont longer than anyone, his back scarred from decades of whippings, his hands twisted from arthritis. "Where do we go?" "North," Sarah said. "There are networks. The underground railroad that we've all heard whispered about. People who help runaways reach free states. I have money," she lifted the heavy box. "Enough to get everyone started. Food, bribes, whatever you need. But we have to move fast, tonight, before they can organize to stop us." "This is a trap," someone said from the crowd. "A way to catch us running so they can punish us worse." "I understand why you'd think that. God knows we've all learned not to trust. But look at me." Sarah stepped fully into the torchlight. "You all knew my mother, Ruth. You saw what happened to her under this tree. If there's anyone who has reason to hate the Fairmonts, it's me. But I'm telling you this is real. Mistress Fairmont has freed us, and we need to run before anyone can stop it from being real." Bessie moved to stand beside Sarah. Her voice, weathered and strong from 60 years of survival, carried weight. The child speaking truth. "I've lived through 4 owners. Seen every trick, every false promise. This ain't that. This is the door opening. Whether it stays open or slams shut again, I don't know. But for right now, for tonight, it's open, and I'm walking through it." Others began to nod, to whisper among themselves, the impossible hope starting to take root. "Those with children, those who are old or sick, go first," Sarah said. "Take horses, wagons, whatever you need. There's a station 20 miles north, run by a Quaker family. That's the first stop. From there, the conductors will take you further. Those of you who are young and strong, wait until tomorrow night. Give the vulnerable ones a head start. Spread out. Don't all go the same direction. Make it harder to track you." "What about you?" Joseph asked. "You coming north too?" Sarah had thought about this. She'd thought about little else for the past hours. Her first instinct had been yes, of course. Run, escape. Find freedom in the north like so many others had. But something held her back. Something unfinished. "I'm staying for now. Someone needs to file these papers. Make it official. Someone needs to face Edmund when he comes back. Stand up in court if it comes to that. I'm a free woman now. I can testify. I can fight this in ways you can't, because you need to be gone and safe." "They'll hurt you," Bessie said quietly. "You know they will. White folk don't like it when we stand up to them, even when we're in the right legally." "Maybe. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. My mother died under this tree because she couldn't bend. I used to think that was weakness, but it wasn't. It was strength. The kind of strength that says, here I am, this is who I am, and you can't make me be less than that. I'm staying. For her, for all of us." The crowd began to disperse then, some immediately running to gather their few belongings. Others lingering, touching the oak tree, as if saying goodbye, or perhaps thanking it for witnessing this moment. Sarah distributed the money, making sure families had what they needed, giving directions to the Quaker station, explaining the routes that seemed safest. By midnight, the first group was ready, 20 people, mostly mothers with young children, 2 elderly men, 1 pregnant woman. Sarah watched them leave, moving quietly into the darkness, heading north toward a future that was uncertain, but at least was theirs to shape. Throughout the night, more groups left. Some took horses. Edmund's own horses, a fitting irony. Some took wagons loaded with food from the plantation stores. Some simply walked, carrying nothing but themselves and the papers Sarah had copied out for each family unit, proof of their freedom should they be stopped. By dawn, more than half the enslaved population of Fairmont was gone. The plantation had emptied like water from a broken vessel. The quarters stood silent. The fields would go unworked. Everything the Fairmonts had built was collapsing in real time. Sarah stood on the veranda of the main house as the sun rose, watching the empty drive, the abandoned work buildings, the smoke from breakfast fires in the quarters that were no longer occupied. She felt exhausted but also strangely light, as if she'd been carrying something heavy for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Margaret appeared beside her. She'd dressed properly for the first time in weeks, her hair arranged, her clothes clean. She looked at the empty plantation without expression. They're gone. Yes. Good. Margaret turned to look at Sarah. Edmund arrived an hour ago. He's in the study sending telegrams, consulting with lawyers. He's going to fight this. I know. It won't be easy. They'll say I was incompetent, coerced, under duress. They'll say you manipulated me. Let them say it. The papers are legal, and the people are already gone. Even if the courts rule in Edmund's favor, most of them will be out of reach by then. Margaret nodded slowly. You really are staying. I am. Why? You could run too. Disappear. Start a new life where no one knows you were enslaved. Sarah looked at the older woman. Because someone needs to see this through. Because I want to watch you and Edmund lose everything, the way my mother lost everything. Because I want to stand in that courtroom and tell the truth about this place, about what happened here, about who you were and what you did. Not for revenge anymore, just for the record, so somewhere, someday, someone will know what happened here was wrong, and that at least one person said so out loud. That's dangerous. Everything is dangerous. Living was dangerous. Running is dangerous. Freedom is dangerous. At least this way I'm choosing my danger instead of having it chosen for me. They stood together in silence, watching the sun climb higher. In the quarters, a rooster crowed. In the fields, birds sang. The plantation continued its slow death, nature beginning the process of reclaiming what had been forced from it. I need to tell you something, Margaret said finally. That night under the oak, when I tried to... She trailed off. You were right to stop me, not because I deserve to live, but because dying would have been easier. Living with what I've done, that's the real punishment, and I'm going to do it. However long it takes, however much it hurts, I'm going to carry it all. Good. Margaret looked at Sarah directly. Do you forgive me? No, I didn't think so, but I had to ask. You don't want forgiveness. You want absolution. You want me to tell you it's okay, that you've paid enough, that you can stop feeling guilty now. But I won't do that. What you did to my mother, to everyone here, it's not forgivable. You have to live with that. That's what living means now. Carrying the unforgivable. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Thank you. For the cruelty of truth, for making me live, for... She gestured at the empty plantation. For this, whatever else happens, at least we did this. At least we saved them. We didn't save them. We just stopped destroying them. There's a difference. Edmund's voice cut through the moment. Margaret, get in here, now! Margaret straightened her shoulders. That's my husband, calling me like a dog. I suppose I should go. Yes. What will you do today? Walk to the county seat, file the papers, make it official. Then come back and face whatever comes next. Margaret turned to go, then paused. Sarah, your mother would be proud of you. I know I have no right to say that, but she would be. Sarah didn't respond. She watched Margaret go inside, watched the door close. Then she walked down the steps and across the lawn toward the road. She carried the manumission papers in a leather case, protected from weather. Every name carefully copied, every signature clear. The walk to the county seat took 3 hours. Sarah passed other plantations along the way, saw enslaved people in the fields, saw overseers watching them, saw the whole system still functioning as if nothing had changed. And for most of Georgia, for most of the South, nothing had changed. Fairmont was one plantation. 200 people were a drop in an ocean of millions still enslaved. But drops mattered. Each one mattered. At the county clerk's office, a bored white man looked at her papers with irritation. What's this? Manumission documents for the enslaved persons of Fairmont Plantation. I need them filed and registered. He squinted at the papers, at Margaret's signature, at the list of names. His expression shifted from bored to shocked to angry. This is... Do you have any idea what you're doing? Filing legal documents. That's your job, isn't it? To record them. This is 200 people. the Fairmont plantation's entire workforce. Margaret Fairmont signed this. You can see her signature. Edmund Fairmont will have something to say about this. I'm sure he will. But the documents are legal and properly executed, unless you have a legal reason to refuse them. The clerk looked at her with open hatred. An uppity Negro woman, recently freed, standing in his office and demanding he do his job. Everything about it offended his sense of how the world should work. But the papers were legal. He couldn't refuse them without cause. He filed them with visible reluctance, stamping each page, entering them into the county record. When he handed them back, his hands shook with barely suppressed rage. You think this changes anything? You think 200 darkies running north makes any difference? Yes, Sarah said simply. I do. She walked out of the courthouse into bright December sunshine. The papers were filed. The people were free, at least legally. And whatever happened next, legal challenges, violence, retribution, couldn't change that basic fact. She walked back toward Fairmont, taking her time. She passed the places she'd known her entire life. The creek where children played in summer, the stand of pines where young lovers met secretly, the spot on the road where her mother had taught her to read, making marks in the dirt with a stick. When she reached the plantation, the sun was setting. Edmund's carriage was still in the drive. Angry voices came from the house. Edmund and Margaret fighting, the sound of things breaking. Sarah didn't go to the house. Instead, she walked to the oak tree. She stood under it as darkness fell, looking up at the branches that had witnessed so much suffering. And she spoke to the tree, to her mother, to all the ghosts that haunted this place. It's done, Mama. They're free. Most of them anyway. The ones who left will make it north, I think. The ones who stayed will figure it out. And Margaret, Sarah smiled slightly, Margaret is going to carry her burden for the rest of her life, just like you said. They can't take what's inside us unless we let them. Well, I didn't let them. I learned from her. I learned from you, and I used it all to break the chains. The wind moved through the bare branches, making them creak and sway. In that sound, Sarah almost heard her mother's voice again. Well done, baby girl. Well done. She stayed there until full dark, then walked to the quarters. A few people had remained, the very old, the very young, those too afraid to run or too attached to this place despite everything. They'd built a large fire, and they sat around it, singing the old songs. Sarah joined them. She sat beside Bessie and let the old woman put an arm around her shoulders. You did good, child, Bessie whispered. Real good. Changed everything for us. Changed everything. It's not over. Edmund will fight. There'll be trouble. There's always trouble, but tonight we're free. Tomorrow can worry about itself. They sang through the night, the old songs that had carried them through everything, songs about water and freedom and the promised land, songs that had been sung in African villages, in slave ships, in cotton fields, in moments of despair and moments of triumph. And Sarah sang with them, her voice joining the chorus, feeling the weight of everything that had happened begin to lighten just slightly. Not gone. It would never be gone, but bearable. Transformed into something she could carry without it destroying her. When dawn came, Sarah stood and looked at the house, at the oak tree, at the empty fields. Edmund was still inside, plotting his legal response. Margaret was somewhere in that house, living with her guilt. Gosson had likely run, knowing he had no future here, but Sarah was free. Legally, officially, irrevocably free. She walked to the oak tree one last time. She pulled out a knife and carved 4 words into the bark, deep enough that they'd remain even as the tree grew. I learned from her then. She turned away from the tree, from the plantation, from everything Fairmont represented. She walked down the drive toward the road, toward the north, toward whatever future awaited her. Behind her, the oak tree stood sentinel over the empty fields, its branches spread wide like arms that had finally released their grip on suffering. And in the bark, the 4 words carved deep, a message to anyone who might pass this way. Something terrible happened here. But something powerful happened too. A woman learned from her oppressor how to be strong, and she used that strength to break free. The South would fight, the Civil War would come, millions would die before slavery ended. But in December 1843, on one small plantation in Georgia, 200 people found freedom, and one woman found herself. The rest was history, the kind that doesn't make it into books but lives in the stories people tell, in the memories they carry, in the strength they pass down through generations. The oak tree remembered it all. And when the wind rose through its branches, it whispered the truth to anyone who would listen. Justice came not with a whip, but with papers signed in a shaking hand. Revenge was not violence, but survival. Freedom was not given but taken, carefully, strategically, with the patience of deep water wearing away stone. And sometimes the most shocking revenge is simply to live, to survive what was meant to break you, and to use that survival to break the chains instead. They called it vengeance. The earth called it balance, and history remembered Sarah as the woman who turned her chains into freedom not just for herself, but for 200 souls who walked north under cover of darkness, carrying nothing but hope and the knowledge that someone had stood up and said, "No more." The tree stands still, split by lightning years later. The plantation crumbled, the Fairmonts faded into obscurity. But the story of Sarah, the house slave who learned from her mistress and used that knowledge to destroy the very system that created them both, that story lived on, in whispers, in songs, in the fierce determination of everyone who ever refused to be broken by the world's cruelty. She learned from her, and she used what she learned to set her people free. That's not revenge, that's revolution. And it started under an oak tree in Georgia, on a winter night when 200 people discovered that freedom was not a dream but a decision, and one brave woman made that decision for them all.
I'm freezing. I'm bleeding, slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone